been more than 3 years since the game, now officially titled The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, was announced. And in that time we've seen, well, just enough to really whet our appetite, from the sweeping vistas of the islands above Hyrule through to the tiny details that hint at so much. Let's run through what we know, what we think we know, and what we're probably way off about but are excited to take a punt on anyway. Let's start with Hyrule itself, which is built upon the foundation of Breath of the Wild's map, but much more vertical than usual. Yes, the sky is now thoroughly pocked with islands, but from what we've seen, these islands aren't actually as alien as they may first appear. Take a look at these stone dragons and spiral patterns. Seem familiar? We've seen similar imagery in Breath of the Wild. In that game, they were found in the many ruins left behind by the mysterious Zonai, a long extinct civilization who are thought to have worshipped a water dragon, according to Creating a Champion. That book also says the Zonai are spoken of in hushed whispers as strong magic wielders who vanished suddenly thousands of years ago. Breath of the Wild itself, meanwhile, simply describes them as an ancient warlike tribe. Are the Zonai really long extinct then? After all, we're dealing with a whole new set of Zonai structures, not to mention at least one Zonai-like weapon. So either they're back somehow, or their structures are back somehow, or this game doesn't take place after the events of Breath of the Wild, but instead in the distant past. We'll get into that later, but for now, let's focus on what we can see in this changed version of Hyrule. Most of the floating islands have one thing in common: sharp, pointed undersides that seem to be made of a different material, what looks like a dark green metal. Perhaps these artificial-looking protuberances are tied into the secret of how the islands stay up in the air. Mind you, we've already seen one exception to this. These shapes are very different in their design. The islands themselves also differ a bit in how they're constructed. Some seem to have sheer artificial walls that may or may not be climbable, while others are more natural looking. There are so many of them too, and these are just the ones we've seen. So far, their surfaces seem relatively sparse, topped with small structures and autumnal forests, but there are some intriguing hints too. Is that some kind of control panel? And imagine the grand building that this door could lead into. Is it the entrance to this mysterious structure perhaps? Its roof appears quite ornate, and its top-heavy design is pretty different from anything we've seen in Breath of the Wild. Is it a dungeon complex, an arena, a dragon temple? We don't know, but there does appear to be trees growing out of its terraces, which would indicate that it's old and lacking upkeep. There are other hints that this may be a derelict world up in the sky, such as the cracks on the ground here, and the weeds growing by the sides of the path. In terms of getting around up in the sky, we've seen a shot of Link using a paraglider, but how else will he move between islands? We can see what looks like a ramp here, as well as, is that a wire that could be used as a flying fox? Let's shift focus to the land below. How has the Hyrule we know and love from Breath of the Wild changed? Well, there's one immediately obvious difference, and that is that there are no Sheikah towers or shrines visible. Have they receded back into the ground, or could this take place before they rose up, or even before they were created? There is one tower incidentally, but it certainly appears to be a completely different type of structure. Hyrule Castle, meanwhile, has lifted up out of the ground, powered apparently by great writhing tendrils of malice. Death Mountain is also spewing forth this malevolent red menace. Coming back to Hyrule Castle though, the area around it looks as though great gouges have been torn from it. Is this simply where the water around the castle was, or has more land either collapsed down or been raised up into the sky? And that, in fact, is one of the big questions. Were the Sky Islands we see now formed from the land beneath since the events of Breath of the Wild, or are they older? This small island, for instance, could easily have been plucked from the spot where Ridgeland Tower once stood, but in Breath of the Wild, the base of Ridgeland Tower was a lake. So was this land taken at some point before then? Perhaps even before the Sheikah built the tower? We don't know, but it seems unlikely that the islands we've seen so far were plucked from the Breath of the Wild map we know. Paths such as this, for instance, aren't like anything we've seen before, all of which leads into an alternate theory of where they came from. Or when, which we'll get to in a bit. Returning to our examination of the landscape, there are a number of other differences on the ground compared to Breath of the Wild. These swirling green markers, for instance, are they fast travel points? After all, the Sheikah shrines and towers were a great way to get around the map in Breath of the Wild, but without them, how will players quickly navigate this intimidatingly large world? This one is even close to the Tabantha Bridge stable, just as there was generally a shrine close to each stable in Breath of the Wild. They could also be vertical fast travel points, quickly transporting Link to a land above. This seems plausible given we've already seen glowing green energy associated with travelling up and through a sky island. Speaking of glowing green things, how about this enormous figure atop the rock plateau ahead of Link? Stylistically, it's very similar to some of the other imagery in the most recent trailer, but is distinct from both those figures. Is it some kind of tribal Zonai homing beacon calling the bird glider towards it? And if so, perhaps this will be another way Link will get around Hyrule. It's not the only one, after all. The surface of Hyrule has changed significantly then, and so have the skies above, but there's one other domain that promises to be a big part of the game: the underground. The first hint at this was Link and Zelda in a subterranean space in the game's debut, but the most recent trailer also reveals a cave entrance next to Quarter Lake that wasn't there in Breath of the Wild. This is going to be a whole new Hyrule. But how will it play? From what we've seen, quite differently. Without any Sheikah technology, and hence the Sheikah Slate and all its powers, Link will have a whole new set of tools. We've already seen 2 instances of Link rewinding objects in the world, and while we don't know what the rules are around this ability, it opens up expansive possibilities in much the same way a power like Stasis did in Breath of the Wild. Riding a chunk of island that has fallen to the surface all the way back up into the sky appears to put an enormous amount of power in players' hands. But I suspect that Link will have to rewind an object in motion, as opposed to being able to rewind an object that fell from the sky long ago. Then again, perhaps Link will power up this ability in much the same way he did with the Sheikah Slate, expanding what he can do as the game goes on. One way or another, it appears that this ability is tied to Link's fancy new armband, and in particular the glowing point on the back of his right hand. But how about the newly revealed device Link wears on his hip? This appears in many of, but not all, the shots in the most recent trailer, as well as in the game's key art, so it's clearly important. It also seems able to hold 8 vials, but only has 4 filled in everything we've seen. What's the green substance inside the vials? Well, it could be the source of the power that allows Link to dive up through rock, particularly if, as I suspect, green energy is used to denote the Zonai. That would also then link them to the swirling script sealing Ganon and the armband, which Link then wears, presumably to halt the corruption of the malice on his arm. We also see green markers on the map, and green energy powering this golem-like creature. Colours definitely feel thematic in Tears of the Kingdom. Yellow energy, for instance, looks to be associated with time, just as it was in Breath of the Wild. Yellow energy swirls in the disc on Ganon's forehead, for instance. Perhaps this is how he has remained in stasis through the ages. We also see yellow power associated with the device on Link's hand, which, as we said, appears to give him the ability to rewind objects. Not only that, but if we look at Impa's tapestry in Breath of the Wild, the hero depicted in it also had a glowing yellow hand. Is this history repeating itself? Part of the Zelda series' ongoing cycle of death and rebirth? Or is there another explanation? Let's plunge into the story. We'll start with this stone mural, as it offers plenty of clues as to what Tears of the Kingdom will be about. First of all though, what the mural is showing can be interpreted in a number of different ways. To give 2 examples, it could be a depiction of events that happened long ago, in much the same way Impa described Breath of the Wild's backstory. It may tell of another time that Hyrulean soldiers had to fight off malice-fueled foes. Knocked out or badly injured, the princess is rescued, raised up to a world high in the sky, where the 7 sages are represented by these 7 tear-shaped symbols. Perhaps she then joins a ritual of some sort. We see 2 of the symbols above the figures, to seal the darkness away once more. Another interpretation is that it could actually be a prophecy from ancient times that is destined to come to pass. Either way, my guess would be that Link and Zelda come across this wall in the same network of caves that house Ganon's body, and then unwittingly set events in motion. In our most recent trailer analysis, we posited that the woman in the mural is Zelda. Not necessarily this Zelda, but certainly some version of her, and we guessed that the other figure is the goddess Hylia. Zelda, after all, is intimately linked to Hylia, and in Skyward Sword is actually the mortal reincarnation of the goddess, who is said to have raised up that game's floating islands. This then would be a most suitable figure to be sitting atop a floating platform in the sky and performing some kind of ceremony with Zelda. An alternative to this idea would be that the second figure is instead linked to the Zonai. As mentioned earlier, by the time of Breath of the Wild, the Zonai exist only as a shadow of a once widespread tribe, ancient and forgotten, but once powerful in the ways of magic. They seem incredibly relevant to much of what we've seen so far in Tears of the Kingdom. We've seen their structures underground. We've seen a mural with very Zonai-like markings. We've seen Zonai-like dragon imagery up in the sky. We've seen an unknown script associated with them in several places. And we have a logo that has two dragons forming a circle, both of which are almost identical in design to many of the Zonai dragon depictions in Breath of the Wild. Are the Zonai back in this game then? Or have we travelled back to a time before the Sheikah when the Zonai were dominant? After all, the Zonai were definitely around before the Sheikah. 3 of their shrines contain the Barbarian set, which is Zonai armour, and Zonai structures appear to be meaningful to the Sheikah as well, given they built shrines in many of them. One guess would be that long ago the Zonai mastered some kind of lighter-than-air technology or magic. Given they were dragon worshippers, perhaps they took great chunks of floating land high up into the sky on a quest to discover where the dragons fly off to. This would explain how the Zonai suddenly disappeared thousands of years ago, and perhaps those islands were up there still, out of sight, during Breath of the Wild. This isn't entirely implausible. For the Goron and Kikwi on the surface in Skyward Sword, Skyloft was but a legend. Perhaps now, with Ganon's power growing once again in Hyrule, these islands have been activated and have descended. From what we've seen so far, if this was the case, the Zonai may still be long extinct. Perhaps it's only their technology, their structures and some of their creations that have returned. Continuing along the Zonai train of thought, let's suppose for a minute that Ganon's physical form was sealed using Zonai magic. The body itself has been buried underneath Hyrule Castle since Ganondorf first failed to try and take control of Hyrule.
The history of the royal family of Hyrule is also the history of Calamity Ganon.
He's revived and been sealed away countless times since then, but each time it's only the malice leaking out as the seal decays that manifests in the world, with the root cause, the body itself, left unaddressed. This is how he's able to return time and again.
It's here.
This is it then.
It may be, however, that Ganon has now fully broken the seal, and a series of magical Zonai safeguards have powered up, bringing the islands that hold the key to the sealing magic back to Hyrule. It'd be much the same as the Sheikah shrines and towers activating at the start of Breath of the Wild. And this might explain the autumnal hue of the trees in the sky versus on the ground. They've been in a different season entirely. Perhaps after countless instances of Ganon returning and then being sealed away again, this will be Link and Zelda's chance to break the cycle once and for all. The importance of this cycle is clear after all. It seems to be represented by the circle formed by the hands of Zelda and the unknown figure in the mural, as well as by the Ouroboros in the game's logo. There's also the variation on it embossed on the giant doors. Rather than representing infinity, perhaps this represents events coming to a head. Before we wrap this up, I want to end with a few unanswered questions. What role, if any, will the Sheikah play in all of this? Sure, there's no Sheikah tech to be seen, but there are very prominent Sheikah-like eye symbols all over the place, from the mural itself through to Link's paraglider, shield and new device, and even this creature. If we're dealing with Zonai technology and structures, perhaps these are proto-Sheikah symbols. Perhaps the Sheikah were developing their technology alongside the Zonai, or perhaps they came after and adopted an eye symbol in reference to the Zonai. Here's another one. Given how prominent dragon imagery is across the footage, will dragons play a more central role in this game than in Breath of the Wild? We've already seen a glimpse of one up amongst the Sky Islands, and its blue and white colouring is not only different from the dragons we already know of, but could also indicate that it's the water dragon worshipped by the Zonai. Let's go again. Why do bokoblins suddenly have such long horns? Could this be evidence that we're playing at a different time in history? This far more primitive looking axe would seem to hint as much. The mural, meanwhile, seems to be at another point in their evolution entirely, as these bokos don't seem to match those in Breath of the Wild or in Tears of the Kingdom. Almost there. What's the significance of the depiction of the Master Sword in the logo? We've already seen the ruined Master Sword in-game, and the top half of the sword in the logo certainly conforms to this, but the glowing green bottom half is wonderfully stylized. Is this simply the bottom of a different weapon? Or does the use of green and swirls once again reference the Zonai and indicate that the sword will be restored with Zonai magic? Oh, and there's one other really obvious point that I should make, and that is that the Zonai may not be a benevolent race after all. We know they're warlike after all, and perhaps they chose to use their magic not to protect Hyrule, but to revive Ganon in the first place. Perhaps this is why the eye iconography we see is flipped like the Yiga clans as opposed to the Sheikahs. Who knows, but it's been a whole lot of fun to speculate, and we'll have a heap more on Tears of the Kingdom as we get closer to its release. In the meantime, why not check out why the Great Plateau is gaming's greatest tutorial, as well as 150 tiny things that make Breath of the Wild a game for the ages. And for everything else, you are already in the right place. IGN.